Vernon Hall, Chapter 13. Ezekiel Lloyd. Bertha and I now had a mutual understanding. She trusted me, and I her. We had both seen the ghost of the demonic parlour maid. Perhaps it was her whom Amelia had warned me of. I wanted to ask Pastor Franklin about the woman, but noticing how he had avoided me ever since Amelia's death, I decided against it. The day after my encounter with the ghost in the dungeon, I sat in the drawing room, staring out of the window, lost in a daydream. It was a beautiful afternoon. The sun glowed, and the Italian garden radiated with vibrant color. We had just finished lunch, and Bertha went into the scullery to wash the dishes, when there was a loud knock at the main door. I shrugged off the reverie I was lost in. Bertha tiptoed into the drawing room. "If it's Gareth again, what shall I say to him, miss?" she whispered. "Let him in, Bertha." Bertha proceeded to the main door, and I retreated to the sofa. A moment later, Bertha re-entered the drawing room with a rather sullen look on her face. Towering behind her was the man of my dreams. He had returned. I could hardly contain my emotions as my heart leapt with joy at the sight of that dashing Prince Charming. I leapt up beaming. Seeing how excited I had become, Bertha raised her eyebrow and gave me a reproachful look. I quickly composed myself and bowed. Our guest ran his hand through his silky dark hair and smiled at me, his hazel eyes twinkling. "It's nice to see you again, Mr. Lloyd," I said calmly. Ezekiel Lloyd walked straight to me, took my hand, and kissed it gently. "I know I'm older than you, Eleanor, but don't be so formal. Just call me Ezekiel, please," he requested. This request was somewhat familiar. It was similar to what Amelia had said to me the day she brought me to Vernon Hall. I felt such an uncanny familiarity with this handsome man. Bertha then interrupted. "May I get you some tea, sir?" she asked rather sternly. With the most gracious of etiquettes, Ezekiel bowed to Bertha and said very courteously, "If it won't trouble you, my darling, please do. I don't have a horse, I'm afraid, and I have walked a long way. I am a little weary, and I would love a cup of tea, especially one made by your hands." I could see Ezekiel had a way with words, as even Bertha seemed touched. Her round eyes sparkled with glee, and a subtle smile crept upon her face. She immediately lifted her dress and hurried into the kitchen. I was now alone with Ezekiel, and we both sat on the sofa. "I waited for you, but you didn't come the week before." "Forgive me, Eleanor. As I said, I don't have a horse, and I was taken ill. I caught a cold that night, and I was bedridden. My sincerest apologies. But tell me, how are you feeling now?" he inquired politely. "I'm much better, thanks to you. My swelling has decreased, and I can walk around, though I have a limp. You were so kind that night, I never even got a chance to express my gratitude to you." He gently touched my hand. "Eleanor, I just told you not to be so formal. It was the least I could do. You don't have to thank me for that. I would do it 100 times again for you, if need be." I blushed. "Ezekiel, I was in so much pain that night. I couldn't talk to you properly. Please do tell me, were you treating Amelia for consumption?" Ezekiel narrowed his eyes, his gaze fixed on me, then said, "No. You see, it's difficult to explain to the layperson, but I am not a physician per se. I studied medicine and I am a doctor, but I deal with diseases of the mind rather than the body." He paused. I knew Amelia wasn't mad, but I also knew the history of Vernon Hall troubled her, so I continued my line of inquiry. "Did something upset her? Was it this house? Is that what she discussed with you?" I asked naively. He cleared his throat. "Eleanor, the truth is, Amelia was a very disturbed woman. She had hallucinations. she thought Vernon Hall was haunted. You see, the trouble was that Amelia's mother had suffered from a similar malady, seeing things, imagining things. So I believe Amelia's condition was hereditary. She needed to talk to someone professionally, which is why she turned to me, he said in a matter of fact tone. Seeing that Ezekiel had declared Amelia mentally unstable, I decided not to disclose what Bertha and I had been seeing, namely the parlour maid's ghost. I see. But I have been told by others that Vernon Hall really is haunted, and that many horrid things took place here. Maybe Amelia wasn't mad after all, I suggested. Oh, God, no. No, I'm not calling Amelia mad. She was one of the most sensible women I've ever known. Very logical, in fact. No, Eleanor, she was just troubled. You do know she lost her parents and her brother. Such tragedies do have a bearing on one's psyche. I sighed. It was true. Amelia had been through a lot. I decided to change the subject and focus on him. Are you affiliated with a hospital, Ezekiel? Ezekiel bit his lip. No, not any longer. As I mentioned before, I left for Europe some years ago. I worked in a hospital there, but something terrible happened, and so I returned. That is why I've decided not to work now. I was intrigued. What happened? Would you share it with me? He nodded sadly. Of course, Eleanor. You see, the professional term for such a hospital is a lunatic asylum. Whilst in Vienna, I worked in such an asylum. I constantly heard their screams. I witnessed their fits. The patients were treated like animals by their caretakers, and they were even locked in cages at times. The treatments were gruesome. Electric shocks, ice baths. Oh, I won't upset you with all the abhorrent details. Suffice it to say that if ever there were hell in this world, then that place was it. He paused, and I gently touched his hand. I'm sorry for asking, Ezekiel. I'm sure it must have been difficult for you. Bertha entered the drawing room carrying a tray with tea and biscuits. She poured out a cup for Ezekiel, who took Bertha's small pudgy hand and kissed it. For the first time, Bertha blushed, exclaiming, "Oh my, what a gentleman you are! Now finish your tea before it gets cold." She beamed and trotted back to the kitchen. Let me finish, Eleanor. There is more. I was assigned the case of a young woman. She was, to put it bluntly, delusional, and believed that she had seen Satan. I would sit with her for hours and listen to her. I was probably the only one who listened to her, and I was very kind to her. In fact, the more I heard her painful stories, the more I felt compassion for her. That compassion slowly became something else. She felt it too, I could tell. But the caretakers didn't approve of our intimacy. They were brutal monsters and locked her in solitary confinement. When I pleaded for them to release her a few weeks later, she was already gone. She had killed herself, stolen a blade from one of the caretakers, and cut the vein in her neck. He paused and gulped. I felt uneasy. I was sorry for Ezekiel and his patient. He walked to the window and stood there pensively. I followed and stood behind, observing him, yearning for him. He continued, I decided never to practice again, which is why I've returned to England. I don't even have a proper home to live in. I have rented a cabin near the sea. After a moment's silence, I spoke. Ezekiel, I am so terribly sorry. I had no idea you had been through so many hardships, but I am so glad that you are home now. A cabin by the sea must be so enchanting. I smiled, though solemnly. Ezekiel took my hand in his and caressed it. I'll take you there someday to my cabin. We can watch the moon together and listen to the gentle waves of the sea. Envisioning that paradisiacal scene together with Ezekiel transported me into another universe. I nodded blissfully. Ezekiel then glanced at his pocket watch and said, "I'd best leave now, Eleanor. I have some paperwork to look into. Oh, but before I do, if it's not too much trouble for you, may I see Amelia's body?" I had been so silly and so enraptured by Ezekiel's beauty and charm that I had completely forgotten about taking him to the dungeon. I led him there all the while wondering whether he would accuse me for keeping her in such a state. But he didn't. He lowered his gaze out of respect as he stood silently by Amelia's casket. I tried to detect an emotion on his face, but he only furrowed his brow. There was no sadness, no anxiety, and no fear. He then followed me upstairs and we walked in the Italian garden. It was warm, the sun blinded my eyes, the birds sang mellifluously, and the waves of the enchanting sea crashed in the background. "My chauffeur Hugo has gone for the day, otherwise I would have asked him to take you home in our carriage," I explained. "It's all right, Eleanor. I like to walk. Thank you for your kind offer. The next time we meet, you must come to my cabin, but you must come alone. I have become a bit of a recluse, Eleanor, and frankly, I don't wish to meet anybody. Anyone but you, that is." I blushed again. "My cabin is at the very far end of the shores by the cave. It has a small lantern outside. Do you think you'll be able to find it?" His hazel eyes sparkled under the sun as he spoke in his deep, captivating voice. "I will find your cabin, Ezekiel, and I will come to you, alone." My heart galloped at the thought. He kissed my hand once more and bowed graciously and left, relishing in the moonlight with Ezekiel at his cabin by the sea. For many days to come, that was the only thought that conquered my heart and my mind, and I decided not to disclose my proposed rendezvous to Bertha.